When we refer to the fall of Rome, what do we mean? We could mean the collapse of its military. We could mean the failing of its bureaucracy. We could mean the change of culture. We could mean the fall in quality of manufactured goods. We could mean any and all of these things. But all of these things, their triumphs and declines, are tied to and inseparable from the successes and the failures of the Roman town. Towns were the centre of the Roman world. Before the Romans did anything else in a newly conquered territory, they established new towns built with stone, announcing to the world that a new power was not only here, but that a new power was here to stay. Though they were built primarily as military bases, they were also centres of government, bureaucracy, communication, culture, entertainment and trade. Each town was only one node in an empire-wide neural network of thousands of towns which shared government, ideas, consumer goods and culture. The Roman town allowed specialists to master skills which didn't involve the production of food. Skills which they could learn by tapping into an interconnected community of people mastering the same skill throughout the empire. They could then use that same network to trade their product: clothing, jewellery, pottery, tools. Local farmers and landowners relied on these towns. They could sell surplus wheat, olives, grapes, and in return obtain luxury goods. The abundance of towns, the sharing of ideas, the specialisation of skills and the trade that they could allow were not only what made Rome powerful, they were what made the entire classical economy function. Towns were the centre, the brain, of an empire which governed a third of the world's population. In the Western Roman Empire specifically, for hundreds of years, the Roman state would slowly corrode. Over decades, decisions which make sense and promote loyalty would do the opposite, leading to the decline, decay, and the eventual collapse of the urban network which defined the classical economy. This would take with it the Roman state's direct command over Western Europe. The results are visible in the 5th century, but the seeds for the end were first planted in the 1st century BC, with the stretching of Roman control northwards, away from the Mediterranean, into Gaul and Britain. Service in the Roman military was strenuous. Soldiers served for a minimum of 25 years, conquering land, quelling rebellions and halting invaders. After their service, they were rewarded citizenship and their own landstead, a small piece of the empire which they had devoted their life to protecting. This system had 3 advantages for Rome. Firstly, the recently conquered land had many resources that Rome wanted and needed. Food, mainly, which helped the classical economy function, but also metals and stone. Secondly, the Romans had built new towns nearby, which would be fed, governed and sold resources by the nearby landowners. Thirdly, they wanted newly conquered land to be Romanized, for a newly obtained territory to express itself in Roman terms. This allowed for the slow and eventual absorption of local cultures, evaporating local identities and ensuring minimal rebellion. Most military personnel would receive a relatively small plot of land. This would produce enough food to help the landowner survive, pay taxes, and earn a pension by selling produce in the town. Owning this land was still a huge honour, but this would not allow much social mobility. They could accrue wealth, but probably not vastly improve their position. Very few who had served in the top of the Roman military structure received a huge plot of land to feed not only their immediate family, but also slaves and staff, with healthy profits besides. As any government would, Rome demanded tax equal to a proportion of the value of land. This would go to funding the bureaucracy, the government, the towns and the military throughout the empire. In return, the landowners' wealth was legitimised. They would receive the legal and, importantly, the military backing of Rome. Those who occupied important civil positions in the towns were exempt from tax. The military backing of landholdings and the tax exemption incentivised continued involvement with the Roman state, even after retirement. Land ownership was a huge boon. Owning land provided food and disposable income. If landowners bought more land, the produce would be almost entirely profit. More land would mean more resources, more money, more disposable income, and more power within towns. There was no downside. Land holdings grew and grew. Local politics became dominated by few landowners who held powerful positions and commanded influence in the area, who practically single-handedly sustained the town with their land's produce. These people were still tax exempt, and this would be ideal for them, because the return on investment of taxes was becoming less and less clear. Taxes which were paid in Roman Gaul could be spent as far afield as Egypt. The Roman state seemed to become an endless money sink. The interests of a professional landholder are very local. Everything integral to a landholder's business is on their doorstep. Their interests and successes are tied to their own private property, rather than the successes of a wider state. Widespread tax evasion became the norm, as the Roman state faced further and further issues, internal strife and foreign invasion. For the state, the lack of income could only exacerbate issues. At best, the military was unmotivated and slow to respond. At worst, they were mutinous. Invasion was a real and continuing threat at the frontiers of the empire. The one advantage of military protection could no longer be guaranteed. To combat the issue, landowners hired mercenaries to protect their land, legitimising their landholding without Rome. These fighters could have been mutinous Roman soldiers, but by and large, Germanic warriors were paid to protect the landholders in Britain, Gaul, and Hispania. Landowners no longer had to be reliant on Rome for anything, but the extent to which this was independence is debatable. Certainly, in some schools of political science, this would be viewed as a declaration of independence, but they may still have considered themselves Roman, and they may still have expressed themselves in Roman culture. This may have been viewed as a temporary necessity, or it may have been a permanent decision. We can't know this for certain, but the fact remains that they were no longer reliant on Rome for anything. Only large landowners could afford an army. Smaller landowners, whether less rich or simply landowning free families, could not afford protection. These landowners were easy targets. There wasn't much they could do, so they entered agreements with their richer neighbours. In exchange for a small amount of food, the smaller landowner would receive the protection of their neighbour's army. Let's think about this relationship. The larger landowner protected the smaller landowner for a fee. The mercenaries could wander freely across the smaller landholder's land. If we call this fee a tax, then this sounds less like a business arrangement, and it begins to sound more like a smaller nation has just capitulated to a larger conquering power. Roman law could no longer operate in these areas, and the large landowners only became more powerful as a result. It was beneficial for landowners to turn their back on Rome. The Roman town and the specialists inside it were also affected. Uncertainty and invasion is bad for business, and the lacking funds of the Roman state affected its government, gutting Roman towns of its urban bureaucracy. In the absence of the Roman state, and as local economics and politics were reliant on the larger landowner, elections, and politics in general, began to fade away entirely. Uncertainty made the price of land in towns fall lower and lower, until the town became worth nothing more than its material value, the stone, lead, and other resources which made it up. Very few now had the income, or the ability, or even the willpower to stay in the town full time. Urbanites would gut their property of its valuable metals, and find a wealthy landowner for whom they could work. Some of these urban areas would never be inhabited again. Others still haven't reached their population in the Roman period. The Roman town withered, representing the end of the Western Roman Empire. Meanwhile, where rich landowners lived, exploded in economic activity. It was converted to become an economic core. Pottery was produced locally to store the landholder's surplus grain, looms to allow the manufacture of high-quality clothing from the landowner's wool. Mines exploited the metal, which were smelted and purified on site, which were then used to make tools, swords for their militia, or hoes for their workers. The landowner owned the land, the resources in the land, and the people who worked the land. To say that the local economy was tied to the landowner at this stage would be an understatement. The local economy was the landowner. The poor, the small-scale landowners had become poorer. The rich, the large-scale landowners, had become richer. And the middle, the merchants, the urbanites, the professionals, the moderately scaled landowners were squeezed into the servitude of the rich. Every decision, every trade, every resource extraction was done to meet his wants and needs. What was once a Roman landholding had become a post-Roman kingdom. Feudalism to an extent that we can't really fathom today. What did this look like in practice? In Western Britain, there were some landowners who, alongside growing food, could also extract a highly desired metal: tin. Integral in the crafting of bronze, tin was highly prized in the Mediterranean, even after Western Rome had faded away. On the Aegean coast, ships were loaded with luxury goods: olives, oil, wine, exotic foods, tablewares, glass vessels, and items to manufacture jewellery. High quality goods which were expensive in the Mediterranean. In Britain, these goods were astronomically priced. The ships loaded with these goods set off, travelling through the Mediterranean, through the Strait of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast to Britain, a journey of over 5,000 kilometres which would take over 6 months. There they would find men waiting on the shore. The ships were unloaded of luxury goods, and they were replaced with vast quantities of mined and purified tin. The round trip to Britain and back would have taken them well over a year. With these items, the landsteads in Western Britain could craft highly valuable goods, suited only for kings. The goods diminished in quality without the exchange of ideas or skills that towns allowed, but in a small pocket of Western Britain, Roman culture persisted, in some form, through the 5th and 6th centuries. Communication with other areas of the former empire was rare. The ships from the Aegean came only once per year. The lack of communication had caused cultural shift. The sites in Western Britain, the former Roman villas, faded. The whole of society began understanding themselves as Germanic, speaking a Germanic language, leaving behind their Latin and Brittonic languages. In other areas, people only spoke to their local neighbours, and the version of Latin that they spoke slowly morphed, becoming many local dialects which would become French, Spanish and Italian. Many hundreds of landowners formed their own local kingdoms, which showed their wealth off to each other, in terms which were slowly less and less Roman. Without towns, Roman culture was no longer uniform. What we associate with being Roman had faded away. Rome collapsed, so we say. How accurate is it to say that? The truth is that day by day, over centuries, Rome was less capable and more cumbersome to the Western Roman Empire. We may look upon the masonry of the Romans and see the beauty, the decadent triumph of the greater arts. We may contrast this with the houses made of wood, or the buildings put together with recycled stone, and think that the economy has collapsed or failed. We may see this art as declining, see writing disappear, see towns wither, and believe that the classical world has fallen. This says more about us than it does about Rome, or the post-Roman world. Certainly, this was the popular Christian view. The world was considered declining, and in its final stages before the end of times. This is where our view, that of a Rome that fell, stems from. But in the 5th century, this was not a widely shared view. Why would it be? The Roman government, economy, and political system had proven itself fundamentally inept. There was no sense that the classical world was disappearing as towns withered, or as Germanic defenders were invited. There was no sense that the Roman town was important. It could merely have been seen as a novel relic of a bygone age. Not mourned, not missed. People were just responding to a problem they had there and then. Rome had failed people. They couldn't have known, and likely wouldn't have cared, that their actions meant the ultimate end of Rome, or the collapse of the classical world.